Most people think Rome collapsed because barbarians stormed the gates. It's a simple story. An empire becomes weak, enemies invade, everything falls apart. But history is rarely that simple. Because by the time the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD, Rome's economy had already been slowly breaking down for generations. The real collapse didn't begin on a battlefield. It began with decisions. Small decisions. Reasonable decisions. Decisions that solved today's problems, while quietly creating much bigger ones for tomorrow. At first, almost nobody noticed. The empire was still expanding. Its armies were still powerful. Its cities were still wealthy. From the outside, Rome still looked unstoppable. But underneath that image of strength, the foundations were beginning to crack. Government spending kept rising. The currency slowly lost its value. Taxes became heavier. Trade became more difficult. Each problem seemed manageable on its own. But together, they created a system that became harder and harder to hold together. And that's what makes Rome's story so fascinating. Because the empire wasn't destroyed overnight. It was weakened gradually, until one day it could no longer absorb another crisis. History remembers the moment Rome fell, but the far more important question is, what happened before it fell? How does the richest and most powerful economy on Earth slowly begin working against itself? And more importantly, could the warning signs have been seen long before the collapse became obvious? Because Rome's story isn't just about the past. It's one of history's clearest examples of how great economies can slowly undermine themselves without anyone believing the end is anywhere close. Today, we're going back nearly 2,000 years to uncover what really happened when Rome's economy collapsed. To understand why Rome's economy eventually collapsed, you first have to understand what made it so powerful in the first place. At its peak, the Roman Empire controlled vast stretches of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its roads connected continents, its ports linked global trade routes, its currency was trusted across the ancient world. Taxes flowed into Rome from every corner of the empire. Merchants carried goods thousands of kilometers, and for centuries, prosperity seemed almost guaranteed. But maintaining an empire of that size came at an enormous cost. Every new province had to be defended, every road maintained, every frontier guarded, every soldier paid. As Rome expanded, so did the cost of keeping the empire together. At first, conquest solved that problem. Victorious armies returned with gold, silver, land, and slaves. Those victories didn't just make Rome richer, they funded the empire itself. But eventually, Rome reached its limits. There were fewer wealthy territories left to conquer. Expansion slowed, and the flow of new wealth that had fueled generations of growth began drying up. The problem was, government spending didn't slow with it. The army still had to be paid. Public works still had to be funded. The bureaucracy continued growing. Rome suddenly faced a challenge that every government eventually encounters. How do you maintain yesterday's promises with today's shrinking income? Rather than dramatically cutting spending, Roman emperors often searched for easier solutions. One of the most damaging involved the empire's money itself. For generations, the Roman denarius had been one of the most trusted currencies in the world. Its value came largely from the silver it contained. But over time, that silver content was gradually reduced. New coins looked almost identical, but each one contained less precious metal than the one before it. On paper, the government could produce more money. In reality, each coin quietly became worth less. Prices slowly began rising. Confidence weakened. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Ordinary Romans may not have understood monetary policy, but they understood that their money no longer bought what it once did. As inflation spread, the government responded with even more intervention. Price controls were introduced. Taxes increased. Businesses faced heavier burdens. Instead of restoring confidence, many of those policies made trade even more difficult. The economy that had once connected an empire was becoming slower, less efficient, and increasingly fragile. None of this happened in a single year. It unfolded across decades, generation after generation, until economic pressure became part of everyday life throughout the empire. And by the time the cracks were impossible to ignore, Rome's greatest strength had quietly become one of its greatest weaknesses. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome's economy was no longer collapsing because of one single problem. It was collapsing because decades of smaller problems had begun feeding into one another. Inflation weakened confidence. Higher taxes discouraged production. Trade slowed. Government finances became increasingly strained. Each attempt to solve one problem often created another. And as the economy weakened, the empire became less capable of responding to new crises. When barbarian tribes crossed Rome's borders, they weren't attacking an empire at the height of its strength. They were entering a civilization that had already spent generations slowly exhausting the foundations that once made it powerful. The armies were smaller, the treasury was weaker, infrastructure had deteriorated, political instability had become normal. Rome could still win battles. What it could no longer do was consistently recover from setbacks. That may be the greatest lesson Rome leaves behind. Great powers rarely disappear because of one catastrophic event. More often, they lose the flexibility that once allowed them to overcome challenges. Economic resilience slowly fades. Confidence weakens. Institutions become less effective. And every new crisis becomes harder to solve than the last. History often remembers the dramatic ending, the sack of cities, the invasions, the emperors. But those moments are usually the final chapter, not the beginning of the story. The real story often starts decades earlier, inside an economy that gradually loses the ability to sustain the system it created. That's why Rome remains one of the most important economic case studies ever recorded. Not because history repeats itself exactly. It doesn't. Every civilization faces different challenges, different technologies, different political systems, different people. But throughout history, certain economic principles appear again and again. When governments spend beyond what economies can sustainably support, when currencies lose public confidence, when production weakens while financial pressure grows, and when short-term solutions continually replace long-term reform, the consequences rarely appear overnight. They emerge slowly, almost invisibly, until eventually, the system becomes far less resilient than it appears from the outside. Rome reminds us that the strength of a civilization is measured by far more than its military, or the size of its cities, or even the wealth it creates. Its true strength lies in the resilience of the economic foundations supporting everything above them. Because history's greatest empires rarely collapse in a single moment. Long before the world notices the fall, the economy beneath them has often already begun to break. This is what empire economics is about. Looking beyond the headlines to understand the economic forces that quietly shape nations, empires, and societies. Because the biggest turning points in history often begin long before anyone realizes they're happening.